Hello, welcome to Crimson Noir.
Important. Amberley Court stood at the edge of the village like a house that had learned to keep its own counsel. It was not the largest estate in the county, nor the oldest, but it possessed a severe dignity that made smaller houses seem too eager and newer ones too loud. Its long windows looked over clipped lawns, yew walks, and a rose garden that had once been famous enough to draw visitors from 3 parishes. On the afternoon of Lady Amberley's charity luncheon, the house had opened its doors with careful elegance. Tables were arranged beneath white awnings, silver tea urns gleamed on the terrace, and the village came dressed in its Sunday best, though it was only Thursday. Miss Marple sat near the edge of the terrace, quietly turning a teaspoon in her saucer, while appearing to take no particular interest in anyone. This, as usual, allowed her to notice a great deal. Lady Beatrice Amberley moved among her guests with cool grace. She was a tall woman with silver hair, pale eyes, and a manner that made thanks feel like instructions. Her nephew, Mr. Philip Amberley, stood near the rose steps, smiling too often and too brightly. Beside him was his wife, Evelyn, delicate and nervous, her hands forever adjusting gloves that required no adjustment. At the far end of the terrace stood Mr. Victor Harrow. He was not local. That alone made him interesting. He had arrived that morning invited by Lady Amberley herself, though no one seemed to know why. He was a dark, polished man of middle years, with watchful eyes and a voice smooth enough to make ordinary remarks sound confidential. Miss Marple noticed that Lady Amberley avoided looking at him. She noticed too that Philip Amberley did not. Important. At 3:30, luncheon had given way to coffee, and the guests drifted toward the rose garden for the small ceremony in which Lady Amberley would announce the charity total. Mr. Harrow remained near the terrace doors, speaking quietly with Evelyn Amberley. Then a glass fell. It shattered sharply against the stone. Everyone turned. Mr. Harrow stood very still, one hand pressed against the table beside him. His face had gone oddly grey. "I beg your pardon," he said, then he collapsed. For one suspended moment no one moved. Evelyn screamed. Philip rushed forward. Lady Amberley remained where she was, her face perfectly still. Dr. Moss, who had been discussing begonias with the rector's wife, hurried across the terrace and knelt beside the fallen man. Miss Marple rose slowly. She did not go too near. Crowds around a body, she knew, rarely improved matters. Dr. Moss felt for a pulse, then looked up. "He is dead," he said quietly. The terrace, a moment before full of soft conversation and china sounds, became silent. Miss Marple's eyes moved over the scene. The broken glass, the coffee cup beside it, the folded napkin on the table, and near Mr. Harrow's hand, half hidden beneath the edge of the cloth, a small calling card. Miss Marple looked at it for only a moment. Then she looked at Lady Amberley. The older woman had not moved, but her eyes were fixed on the card, and in them, for one brief instant, Miss Marple saw no shock, recognition. Important. The stillness on the terrace broke slowly, like something fragile giving way under pressure. Voices returned, though hushed and uncertain, and movement followed, tentative at first, then more purposeful as people sought either to assist or to distance themselves from what had occurred. Dr. Moss remained beside Mr. Harrow, his expression grave but composed. Philip Amberley knelt nearby, one hand hovering uselessly as though unwilling to accept the finality of the moment. Evelyn stood a little apart, her face pale, her hands trembling despite her efforts to steady them. "Is there nothing to be done?" she asked. "No," said Dr. Moss quietly. "Nothing at all." Lady Amberley moved forward at last. Her composure had not broken, but Miss Marple observed that her steps were slower than before, as though each one required a measured decision. She stopped just short of the body and looked down. "How unfortunate," she said. The words were correct, but they were not, Miss Marple thought, sufficient. Inspector Hale arrived sooner than expected, summoned by a message sent immediately by one of the footmen. He was a careful man, deliberate in both speech and movement, and his presence brought a certain order to the scene that had begun to feel unsteady. "No one has moved him?" he asked. "No," said Dr. Moss. "Good. Inspector Hale crouched briefly beside the body, observing without touching, then rose and turned his attention outward. "I shall need a clear account of what happened," he said, "from the beginning." Mrs. Ambrose, who had seen everything from a position near the urn, began to speak at once, though her account wandered before settling into something more useful. Others added their observations who had been standing where, who had spoken to Mr. Harrow, who had heard the glass fall. Miss Marple listened. It was not the words themselves that interested her, but the differences between them. Inspector Hale allowed each to speak in turn, then said, "And immediately before this occurred was Mr. Harrow alone." There was a pause. Evelyn Amberley spoke. "No," she said. "He was speaking with me." Inspector Hale looked at her. "About what?" "Nothing important," she replied. "Only the garden." Miss Marple's eyes rested on her gently. That, she thought, was not quite true. Inspector Hale nodded. "And Tan?" "He reached for his cup," Evelyn said. "And the glass fell." "Then he fell." Inspector Hale turned slightly. "Did anyone else approach him?" There was a brief hesitation. Philip spoke. "I was nearby," he said, "but I did not speak with him at that moment." Inspector Hale inclined his head. "And you, Lady Amberley?" She met his gaze calmly. "I had just turned toward the garden," she said. "I saw him fall." Inspector Hale's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then moved on. Miss Marple stepped a little closer to the table. The broken glass lay where it had fallen, the fragments catching the light. The coffee cup remained upright, though its contents had been disturbed, and the clothfurry slightly displaced revealed once more the edge of the calling card she had noticed earlier. Inspector Hale followed her movement. "You have observed something, Miss Marple?" "Yes." She smiled faintly. "Only a small thing," she said. "The card." Inspector Hale bent and picked it up. It was plain, unadorned, with a name printed neatly upon it. He looked at it for a moment, then at the body. "This was not here before," he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "No," she said. "Important. I do not think it was." Inspector Hale turned to the group. "Did anyone see this card given to Mr. Harrow?" There was silence. Miss Marple folded her hands, because she knew with quiet certainty that the card had not been left by chance. It had been placed, and placed at precisely the moment when it would be seen, or perhaps when it would not be noticed at all. Important. Inspector Hale did not immediately read the name on the card aloud. Instead, he turned it once between his fingers, as though testing its weight in the situation rather than its material substance. Then he slipped it into his notebook with quiet deliberation. "We will return to that," he said. There was a murmur among the guests, faint but persistent. Curiosity had begun to overcome restraint. A name, Miss Marple thought, was never a small thing. It had a way of drawing attention even when silence was preferred. Inspector Hale looked at Evelyn Amberley again. "You were speaking with Mr. Harrow," he said. "Did he appear unwell?" "No," she replied. "Not at all. He was quite composed." "Did he receive anything while you were with him?" Evelyn hesitated. "No." Miss Marple watched her. That, she thought, was not entirely complete. Inspector Hale turned to Philip. "And you were nearby?" "Yes." "Did you see anyone approach the table?" Philip shook his head. "No." Inspector Hale nodded slowly, though his expression suggested he was not entirely satisfied. "Then we must consider that whatever was placed here was done so without attracting attention," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. He looked at her. "You agree?" "I think it's likely," she replied. "People do not always notice what is done quietly, particularly when they are occupied with other things." Inspector Hale considered this. "And you believe the card is connected to death?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." "In what way?" She smiled faintly. "It is not often that a man collapses beside something that has no meaning to him," she said. There was a pause. Inspector Hale nodded. "Then the card meant something." "Yes." "And to him?" "Yes." Inspector Hale turned back to the group. "Important. Who among you recognizes the name on this card?" he asked. There was silence. No one spoke. But Miss Marple did not need words, because she had already seen it, not in speech, but in the smallest of reactions. She turned her head slightly and looked at Lady Amberley. The older woman had not moved, but her gaze just for a moment had shifted, not to the inspector, not to the body, but to the place where the card had been. Miss Marple folded her hands. Inspector Hale spoke again. No one? There was still no answer. Miss Marple said gently, "It is curious." Inspector Hale looked at her. "And yes? That no one recognizes a name," she said, "when it has been placed so carefully." There was a pause. Inspector Hale's expression sharpened slightly. "You think it was meant to be recognized?" "Yes." "And by whom?" Miss Marple's eyes rested once more on Lady Amberley. "I think," she said softly, "that it has already been recognized." The words settled into the quiet. Inspector Hale did not press the matter immediately. Instead, he turned once more to the table, the broken glass, the undisturbed cup, the faint displacement of the cloth, everything in its place, and yet not as it had been. Miss Marple's gaze lingered there, because now, she thought, the pattern had begun, the man, the card, the moment, all connected. And somewhere in that connection was the reason why Mr. Harrow had died at precisely that time and in precisely that way. Important. Inspector Hale did not immediately pursue Miss Marple's last remark, though it had clearly lodged in his thoughts. Instead, he moved a little further along the terrace, positioning himself where Mr. Harrow had stood before he fell. From there, he could see not only the table, but the arrangement of guests as they must have been moments earlier. If the card was placed deliberately, he said, then the person who placed it must have been close enough to do so without being noticed. "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. Inspector Hale nodded. "And at a moment when attention was elsewhere." "Yes." There was a pause. Inspector Hale turned to Evelyn Amberley. "You were speaking with Mr. Harrow," he said. "Did he break off the conversation at any point?" Evelyn hesitated. "I perhaps," she said. "Only for a moment." "In what way?" "He seemed distracted," she replied, as though something had caught his attention. Inspector Hale's gaze sharpened. "Something or someone?" Evelyn's eyes lowered slightly. "I cannot say." Miss Marple watched her quietly. That, she thought, was not entirely true. Inspector Hale continued. "And during that moment, could someone have approached the table?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "I suppose they could have." Inspector Hale nodded. "And you would not necessarily have seen them?" "No." There was silence. Inspector Hale turned to Philip. "You were nearby." "Yes." "Did you observe anything of this kind?" Philip shook his head. "No." Miss Marple's eyes rested on him. His answer had come quickly, too quickly. Inspector Hale looked thoughtful. "Then we must consider that the action was both brief and precise," he said. "A matter of seconds." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "And done with confidence." Inspector Hale glanced at her. "Confidence?" "Yes." "Important." She folded her hands. "Someone uncertain might hesitate," she said, "or draw attention, but this was done cleanly without disturbance." Inspector Hale nodded slowly. "And that suggests familiarity." "Yes," with the setting, and with the people, Miss Marple added softly. There was a pause. Inspector Hale turned once more to Lady Amberley. "You were some distance away," he said. "Did you notice anything unusual?" She met his gaze calmly. "No." Inspector Hale studied her. "And you did not approach the table before Mr. Harrow fell?" "No." Miss Marple's eyes moved to her. That, she thought, was interesting, because Lady Amberley had not asked what was written on the card, nor what name it bore. Inspector Hale spoke again. "It is curious," he said, "that no one saw the card arriving, yet it was there." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Very curious." He looked at her. "You believe it was not placed openly?" "I think," she said, "that it was given rather than left." Inspector Hale considered this. "Given to him?" "Yes." "And then placed upon the table?" "Yes." There was silence. Miss Marple's gaze moved once more across the terrace. Each face showed some degree of concern, some curiosity, but one showed something else, a stillness, a restraint, as though the appearance of the card had not been unexpected. Miss Marple folded her hands. Because now, she thought, the matter had shifted. It was no longer simply about how the card had come there, but about why it had been given at that exact moment, and why Mr. Harrow had understood it so completely. Important. Inspector Hale remained standing where Mr. Harrow had fallen, as though the exact position might yield something further if considered long enough. His gaze moved from the table to the terrace doors and then to the gathered guests, measuring distances, angles, and the small gaps through which a person might pass unnoticed. "The moment matters," he said. "The card appears. Mr. Harrow notices it, and within seconds he collapses." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. Inspector Hale turned to her. "You believe the card itself caused the reaction?" "I believe it revealed something," she replied, "and that revelation was sufficient." Inspector Hale nodded slowly. "And you think he understood it at once?" "Yes." There was a pause. Inspector Hale said, "Then we must ask what kind of message could be conveyed by a single name on a card." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A very particular kind," she said. "One that does not require explanation." Inspector Hale's expression sharpened. Something from the past. "Yes." There was silence. Inspector Hale turned again to Evelyn. "You said he became distracted," he said. "Did he look at the table?" "Yes." "And 10? He seemed surprised, she said, but not entirely. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said softly. "That is often the case." Inspector Hale looked at her. "You mean he expected something but not this?" "Or expected this but hoped it would not come," she replied. There was a pause. Inspector Hale turned to Philip. "And you noticed nothing?" "No." His answer was immediate. Miss Marple watched him. Too immediate, she thought. Inspector Hale's gaze lingered for a moment, then moved on. "It is curious," he said, "that no one saw the card being given, and yet it must have been." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Important. And by someone he recognized." Inspector Hale nodded. "And someone he did not question." "Yes." There was silence. Miss Marple's eyes moved once more to Lady Amberley. She stood as before, composed, still, entirely in control. But Miss Marple noticed something else. She had not once asked what name was on the card. Inspector Hale spoke again. "Miss Marple," he said, "you think the card was meant for him alone?" "Yes." "And yet it was placed where others might see it?" "Yes." Inspector Hale frowned slightly. "That suggests intention beyond a private message." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said, "it was meant to be both seen and not understood." There was a pause. Inspector Hale considered this. "A signal," he said. "Yes." "And one that only he would recognize?" "Yes." Inspector Hale turned back to the group. "Who among you knew Mr. Harrow before today?" he asked. There was silence. Then, slowly, Lady Amberley spoke. "I did," she said. The words were quiet. "But they changed everything." Inspector Hale looked at her. "In what capacity?" She met his gaze. "From many years ago," she said. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Yes!" That, she thought, had been inevitable. Inspector Hale said, "And the name on the card?" Lady Amberley did not answer at once. But her silence was the answer enough? Miss Marple watched her gently, because now the past had entered the present, and with it everything that had been waiting for precisely this moment to be seen. Important. Inspector Hale did not speak immediately after Lady Amberley's quiet admission. The effect of it seemed to settle over the terrace, altering the tone of the gathering more completely than the earlier confusion had done. What had been uncertain now began to take shape, and with that shape came a different kind of attentionless speculative, more precise. "You knew him," the inspector said, "and he knew you." "Yes," Lady Amberley replied. Her voice remained calm, though Miss Marple observed that her stillness had deepened, as though each word was now being placed with careful intention. Inspector Hale inclined his head. "And the card," he said, "was it connected to that acquaintance?" There was a pause. "Yes," Lady Amberley said. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Yes," she thought. That was quite clear. Inspector Hale stepped slightly closer. "Then I must ask, how did you give him this card?" Lady Amberley did not answer at once. For a moment it seemed she might refuse the question altogether. Then she said, "No." Miss Marple watched her gently. That, she thought, was not entirely true. Inspector Hale's gaze remained steady. You are certain? Yes. There was silence. Miss Marple spoke softly. It is curious, she said, how sometimes we answer the question that is easiest rather than the one that is asked. Inspector Hale glanced at her, then back to Lady Amberley. You deny placing the card, he said, but you do not deny knowing what it signifies. Lady Amberley's eyes met his. No, she said. Inspector Hale nodded slowly. Then we must consider who else might have had access to such knowledge. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said, because a name alone is not sufficient unless one understands it. Inspector Hale turned to the others. Important. Who among you knew of this past connection? There was a pause. Philip Amberley shifted slightly. I knew something about it, he said. Inspector Hale looked at him. What did you know? Only that my aunt had known Mr. Harrow many years ago, Philip said. Nothing more. Miss Marple's eyes rested on him. That, she thought, was incomplete. Inspector Hale said, and the name on the card, did it mean anything to you? Philip hesitated. No, he said. Miss Marple watched him quietly. That hesitation had been small, but not insignificant. Inspector Hale turned to Evelyn. And you? She shook her head. No. Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple noticed that she did not look at her husband. Inspector Hale stepped back. Then we are left with a limited number of possibilities, he said. The card was placed deliberately. It carried a meaning understood by Mr. Harrow, and that meaning was connected to the past. Yes, said Miss Marple gently. Inspector Hale nodded. And it was placed at a moment when it would have the greatest effect. Yes. There was a pause. Miss Marple's gaze moved once more across the terrace. Each face now held a different expression. Curiosity, unease, recognition. But one showed something else, a careful restraint. As though the moment had been anticipated, she spoke softly. It is not only the meaning of the card that matters, she said, but the timing of it. Inspector Hale looked at her. Yes? It was given at precisely the moment when it could not be ignored, she said, and when its effect would be immediate. Inspector Hale considered this. And you think that was intentional? Yes. There was silence. Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on Philip Amberley. Then she folded her hands once more. Important. Because now, she thought, the matter had narrowed. The past, the card, the moment, all connected. And somewhere within that connection was the reason why Mr. Harrow had died, not merely suddenly but inevitably. Important. Inspector Hale did not ignore Miss Marple's last observation, though he gave no immediate indication of how he intended to pursue it. Instead, he shifted his attention back to Philip Amberley, his manner as measured as before, but now with a quiet insistence that was difficult to evade. Mr. Amberley, he said, you mentioned that you knew something of your aunt's acquaintance with Mr. Harrow. Yes. And that knowledge came from where? Philip hesitated. From family conversation, he said. It was not discussed openly. Inspector Hale regarded him. And yet you were aware of it? Yes. Miss Marple watched him gently. That, she thought, suggested more than he intended to reveal. Inspector Hale continued. Did you ever meet Mr. Harrow before today? No. The answer came quickly. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. And yet you recognized him, she said softly. Philip turned to her. I knew who he was, he said. Yes, she replied. That is what I meant. There was a pause. Inspector Hale's gaze sharpened. You recognized him, he repeated. And he recognized you. Philip hesitated. Yes, he said at last. Inspector Hale nodded slowly. Then the past was not entirely confined to Lady Amberley. No, Philip admitted. Miss Marple folded her hands. Yes, she said quietly. That is very often the case. Inspector Hale took a step closer. And the card, he said, did it mean anything to you? Philip's composure faltered slightly. No, he said. Miss Marple watched him. That, she thought, was not true. Inspector Hale's voice remained steady. You hesitated. Only because I do not understand what you are implying, Philip said. Miss Marple spoke gently. My dear, she said, Understanding often arrives before we are ready to acknowledge it. Important. Philip did not reply. Inspector Hale said, "Mr. Amberley, did you approach Mr. Harrow in the moments before his collapse?" "No." "Are you certain?" "Yes." Miss Marple's eyes rested on him. "Not even briefly?" she asked. Philip's expression tightened. "I have already answered that." "Yes," she said. "You have." There was silence. Inspector Hale spoke again. "It is curious," he said, "that the person who placed the card has not yet been identified and, yet the number of those who could have done so is very small." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." "And among them," the inspector continued, "are those who knew Mr. Harrow from before." "Yes." There was a pause. Miss Marple's gaze moved once more across the terrace. Lady Amberley remained composed, though her stillness had deepened. Evelyn stood quietly, her attention divided between her husband and the inspector. Dr. Moss watched with thoughtful concern. And Philip stood very straight, too straight. Miss Marple spoke softly. "It is not always the act itself that reveals the truth," she said, "but the reaction to it." Inspector Hale looked at her. "Yes?" "The card was seen," she continued, "understood, and acted upon, but not by Mr. Harrow alone." There was a pause. Inspector Hale's attention sharpened. "You think someone else recognized it as well?" "Yes." "And reacted?" "Yes." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly toward Philip. "Because recognition," she said gently, "is rarely limited to one person." Philip's composure shifted. Only slightly, but enough. Inspector Hale saw it. "Mr. Amberley," he said, "I will ask you once more, did you place that card?" There was silence. Then Philip said, very quietly, "Yes." The word altered everything. Miss Marple folded her hands. Yes, she thought. Important. Now the pattern was complete. The card had not been accidental, nor merely symbolic. It had been placed by someone who knew exactly what it meant and exactly what it would do. Important. Inspector Hale did not react at once to Philip's admission. He allowed the word to settle, as though its weight must be properly understood before any further question could be asked. Around them, the terrace had grown so quiet that even the faint clink of china from a distant table seemed out of place. "You placed the card," the inspector said at last. "Ah!" Philip's voice was steady, but Miss Marple observed that the brightness which had marked his earlier manner had entirely disappeared. What remained was something more deliberate, something resolved. Inspector Hale inclined his head. "Tell me why." Philip hesitated, though not from uncertainty. It was the hesitation of someone deciding how much to say, rather than whether to speak at all. "Because it had to be done," he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said softly. "That is often how it appears." Inspector Hale stepped slightly closer. "Had to be done for what reason?" Philip looked at him. "Because he could not be allowed to continue as though nothing had happened," he said. "Because what he had done could not remain buried." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." Inspector Hale's gaze sharpened. "Then you knew what the card represented?" "Yes." "And Mr. Harrow knew as well?" "Yes." There was a pause. Inspector Hale said, "And you expected him to react?" Philip hesitated. "I expected him to understand," he said. Miss Marple's eyes rested on him gently. "My dear," she said, "understanding and reaction are rarely separate." Philip did not reply. Inspector Hale continued. "The timing was deliberate," he said. "You chose a moment when he would be among others when his response would be seen." "Yes." "Why?" Philip drew a breath. "Because it would prevent him from denying it," he said. "Important. He could not dismiss it as a private matter." "Not then." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "that is quite true." Inspector Hale regarded him. "You wish to expose him?" "Yes." "And to do so publicly?" "Yes." There was silence. Miss Marple spoke softly. "It is a curious thing," she said, "how people sometimes believe that truth must be forced into the open." Inspector Hale looked at her. "You think that was his intention?" "Yes," she replied. "Not merely to confront but to compel." There was a pause. Inspector Hale turned back to Philip. "And what did you expect would happen?" Philip hesitated again. I thought he would deny it, he said, or attempt to explain. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, but he did neither. No. Inspector Hale said he collapsed. Yes. There was silence. Miss Marple spoke gently. Yes, she said, because the truth, once recognized, does not always leave room for explanation. Inspector Hale considered this. You do not believe he was harmed directly? No, Miss Marple replied, because there is no sign of struggle. No disorder, only the effect of what was seen. Inspector Hale nodded slowly, and the card itself, what name did it bear? Philip's expression shifted. It was not a name, he said. Not exactly. Miss Marple inclined her head. No, she said softly. I thought it might be something else. Inspector Hale's gaze sharpened. Then what was it? Philip looked at him. It was a place, he said. A place from long ago. There was silence. Miss Marple folded her hands. Yes, now it was clear. The card had not been a message in the ordinary sense. It had been a reminder, a single word enough to bring the past entirely into the present. And when Mr. Harrow saw it, he did not need anything more. Important, because he had already known exactly what it meant. Important. Inspector Hale did not immediately question Philip further after the mention of the place. Instead, he stood quite still, as though allowing the meaning of that single detail to arrange itself alongside everything else that had been said. A place, Miss Marple thought, could carry far more weight than a name, particularly when it belonged to memory rather than geography. A place, the inspector repeated. One that both of you recognized. Yes, Philip said. Inspector Hale inclined his head. And one connected to what you described earlier. Yes. There was a pause. Miss Marple spoke gently. My dear, was it somewhere in this village? Philip shook his head. No, he said. Far from here, many years ago. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, she said softly. That is usually the case. Inspector Hale's gaze sharpened. And yet it was enough, he said. Enough to produce this result. Yes. Inspector Hale turned slightly. Lady Amberley, he said. You knew of this place. She met his gaze. Yes. And of what occurred there. Yes. Miss Marple watched her quietly. That admission, she thought, had been expected. Inspector Hale continued. Then we must be clear. What happened at this place? There was silence. Philip spoke before Lady Amberley could answer. It was an accident, he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she murmured. So it is often described. Inspector Hale looked at him. And in reality? Philip hesitated. It was not entirely so, he said. Miss Marple's eyes rested on him gently. No, she said. It rarely is. Inspector Hale's voice remained calm. Explain. Philip drew a breath. There was a fall, he said. A man died. It was said to be a misfortune, but it was not. It was said be something that should not have been done. Important. Miss Marple folded her hands. Yes. Inspector Hale said, and Mr. Harrow was responsible. Philip nodded. Yes, Miss Marple spoke softly. Not directly, perhaps, she said. Philip shook his head. No. But it was his actions that led to it. Inspector Hale considered this. And the matter was concealed. Yes. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. That is very clear. There was a pause. Inspector Hale looked at the envelope again. And you believed that revealing this would force acknowledgement? Yes, and perhaps justice. Philip hesitated. Yes? Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. My dear, justice is a difficult thing to compel, she said. Particularly after so long. Philip did not reply. Inspector Hale said, and Mr. Harrow, what did he do when he saw the card? He understood, Philip said. Yes, and that understanding was enough. Yes. There was silence. Miss Marple spoke gently. Yes, she said, because the past, when it returns in such a form, leaves very little room for denial. Inspector Hale nodded slowly. And you intended that, yes. There was a pause. Miss Marple's eyes moved once more across the terrace. Everything remained as it had been. The tables, the guests, the careful arrangements. And yet everything had changed. She folded her hands. Because now, she thought, there remained only one thing. To make clear not simply what had happened, but why was it inevitable? And why from the moment that card had been placed there had been no other possible end? Important. Inspector Hale did not hurry the conclusion. He stood with the envelope in his hand, his expression thoughtful rather than severe, as though the matter before him required judgment of a different kind than mere fact. Around him the terrace remained quiet, the earlier tension settling into something more subdued, yet no less significant. So, he said at last, Mr. Harrow carried with him the knowledge of what occurred at this place. And today that knowledge was returned to him. Yes, Philip said. Inspector Hale inclined his head. And you ensured that it could not be ignored? Yes. There was no defiance in the answer now, only a steady acceptance. Inspector Hale turned slightly. And his death it was not caused by him, Miss Marple said gently. The inspector looked at her. You are certain? Yes. She folded her hands. There is no sign of violence, she said. No struggle, no disorder. Only the effect of something understood very suddenly and very completely. Inspector Hale considered this. A shock, he said. Yes, Miss Marple replied, but not an unexpected one. Only the final moment of something long anticipated. There was a silence. Dr. Moss nodded. That is entirely possible, he said. The strain of such a realization, particularly if it concerns guilt, can be considerable. Inspector Hale looked at the envelope again. And the card, he said. It will be examined. The matter of the past will not remain concealed. Philip said nothing. Miss Marple's gaze rested on him gently. My dear, she said, it is not concealment that preserves such things, only silencing that is rarely permanent. Inspector Hale closed his notebook. There will be formalities, he said. Statements must be taken. Important. The circumstances of that earlier incident must be reviewed. But as to the death itself, there is no evidence to suggest anything other than natural causes, however sudden. Lady Amberley inclined her head. Yes. Her voice remained composed, but Miss Marple observed that something in her expression had altered, not relief precisely, but the easing of a long-held tension. Inspector Hale turned to her. You understood the meaning of the card, he said. Yes. And you expected something might happen. There was a pause. Yes, she said. Miss Marple spoke softly. It is a curious thing, she said, how people believe the past can be set aside by agreement. No one answered. But it is not so, she continued. It waits. And when it returns, it does so with a certain clarity that cannot be mistaken. Inspector Hale listened. And what people do in that moment, Miss Marple said, tells one everything. She turned slightly, her eyes moving across the terraceth guests, the table, the place where Mr. Harrow had fallen. He was not taken by surprise, she said. He recognized what he saw, and in that recognition everything that had been hidden became visible at once. Inspector Hale nodded slowly. Yes, he said, I believe you are right. The quiet on the terrace deepened, but it was no longer the silence of confusion. It was something steadier, more resolved. Miss Marple moved toward the edge of the lawn, her gaze resting on the roses beyond. They are very fine, she said softly, so carefully tended. Mrs. Ambrose, standing nearby, nodded faintly. Yes, Miss Marple smiled. And yet, she said, even the most carefully tended garden may conceal something beneath the surface. There was a pause. Inspector Hale looked at her. Important. And that, he said, is what we have found here. Yes, Miss Marple replied. She folded her hands once more. Because in the end, she thought, it had not been the card itself that mattered, nor even the death, but the truth that had waited unseen but not forgotten until the moment it could no longer be denied. And when that moment came, everything else had followed, as it always did.